My name is Faith Turner. I'm 37 years old. And the night that shattered my world wasn't when I witnessed a federal crime, or when I realized my 3-year marriage was built on lies I'd been too naive to see. It was standing in my own living room at 11:47 p.m., watching my husband Marcus look 2 Newark police officers directly in the eyes and destroy me with 6 words that would echo in my nightmares forever. She's an unemployed drunk officers. The betrayal hit harder than any physical blow I'd ever taken. This man who'd promised to love and protect me, now calmly explaining to armed police why they shouldn't believe anything his unstable wife might tell them about the federal crimes she'd witnessed that afternoon. Been drinking heavily since she lost her job, Marcus continued, his voice steady with practiced sincerity. Makes up stories for attention. You know how it is. I stood there in my pajamas, watching the officers' expressions shift from professional interest to sympathetic understanding, the look you give someone whose credibility just evaporated before your eyes. The living room felt like a crime scene where I was both victim and evidence. Red and blue lights from 2 Newark patrol cars strobed through our sheer curtains, painting our modest split level in colors that screamed trouble to every neighbor who'd turned on their porch lights to get a better view of the Turner family's midnight drama. I stood barefoot on our hardwood floors, still wearing the cotton pajamas I'd thrown on when the doorbell started ringing at 11:47 p.m. My hair was loose around my shoulders, no makeup, clutching my terry cloth robe like armor that wouldn't stop the bullets. Marcus was about to fire at my credibility. Officers Rodriguez and Chen stood in our doorway, young, professional, the kind of cops who'd seen enough domestic situations to recognize the signs of trouble before anyone started talking. Behind them, I could see Mrs. Patterson from next door pretending to check her mailbox, while actually trying to figure out what had brought police to the quiet cul-de-sac, where the most exciting thing was usually teenagers speeding through the stop sign. That's when Marcus stepped forward, with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own moral authority. "Officers," he said, his voice carrying that particular mixture of concern and embarrassment that made him sound like the long-suffering husband of a problematic wife, "I need to explain something before she starts talking." My stomach dropped like a stone thrown into dark water. I'd called 911 30 minutes earlier to report what I'd witnessed outside Romano's warehouse federal crimes that would make headlines when the FBI finally moved on the information I'd provided. But now Marcus was positioning himself as the reasonable adult who needed to manage his unstable spouse. "My wife has been struggling," he continued, looking directly at Officer Rodriguez with the earnest expression of someone sharing confidential medical information. "She lost her job 6 months ago. Since then, she's been drinking heavily. Daily drinking, all day drinking." The words hit me like physical blows. Each lie landed with surgical precision, designed to destroy my credibility before I could tell these officers what I'd actually seen, what I'd actually reported, why federal agents would be showing up at our door within the hour. "She makes up stories," Marcus pressed on, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone who'd dealt with this problem many times before. "Dramatic stories about crimes and conspiracies. It's attention-seeking behavior that gets worse when she's been drinking." Officer Chen's expression shifted from professional interest to sympathetic understanding. The look you give someone whose credibility just evaporated in front of your eyes. She glanced at me barefoot, pajama-clad, clutching my robe, and I could see her mental narrative forming. Unstable woman, supportive husband, domestic situation that required careful handling. "Sir," Officer Rodriguez said, pulling out his notebook with the practiced efficiency of someone who documented hundreds of similar situations, "can you tell us more about her condition?" Her condition. Like I was a medical case study instead of the woman who'd just provided the FBI with evidence that would prevent a federal crime scheduled for tomorrow morning. "She's been unemployed for 6 months, Marcus replied, warming to his performance while I stood there absorbing every word like incoming artillery. "Severe depression, alcohol dependency. She spends most days on the couch, making phone calls to report imaginary crimes to get attention from authority figures." Imaginary crimes. While Marcus had been at his accounting firm, reconciling client books and attending partner meetings, I'd been documenting money laundering operations that funneled millions through seemingly legitimate businesses. While he'd been complaining about my day drinking, I'd been photographing license plates and recording conversations that would become federal evidence. Check her record if you want, Marcus added with the casual authority of someone who'd never been wrong about anything important to police investigations. You'll see. Multiple calls to various agencies. FBI, DEA, local police. Always reporting conspiracies that don't exist. Always looking for someone to validate her paranoid fantasies. The truth was that my multiple calls had resulted in 3 ongoing federal investigations. That my paranoid fantasies had been confirmed by surveillance operations spanning 2 years. That agents Rodriguez and Chen would learn about within the next 20 minutes, when their supervisor received calls from federal authorities who'd been expecting my report. But standing in my own living room, watching my husband systematically destroy my reputation with lies that sounded more plausible than the truth I was carrying, I felt something I'd never experienced in 3 years of marriage. Complete isolation. "Ma'am," Officer Chen addressed me with the gentle tone reserved for people experiencing mental health crises. "Have you been drinking tonight?" I looked at this young officer, probably late 20s, probably well-intentioned, probably trained to de-escalate domestic situations involving unstable individuals, and realized that anything I said would be filtered through the narrative Marcus had just constructed. "No," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the betrayal burning through my chest like acid. "I haven't been drinking. I called to report federal crimes I witnessed this afternoon. Money laundering operations that are scheduled to move millions of dollars tomorrow morning." The look that passed between Officers Rodriguez and Chen was subtle but unmistakable. The eye contact that said, "Here we go," just like her husband warned us. "Federal crimes," Officer Rodriguez repeated, his tone carefully neutral while he wrote notes that would probably include phrases like "claims to have witnessed and appears to be experiencing." "She does this," Marcus interrupted with the weary patience of someone who'd had this conversation many times. "Grand conspiracies, international crime rings, always federal-level stuff, because that sounds more important than the reality of her situation." The reality of her situation? While Marcus thought my reality involved day drinking and attention-seeking phone calls, my actual reality involved federal agents, who would be very interested to learn that a key witness's credibility was being undermined by domestic interference. What he didn't understand, what Officers Rodriguez and Chen couldn't have anticipated, was that my paranoid fantasies had been generating intelligence reports that were currently sitting on desks at 26 Federal Plaza, waiting for tomorrow's coordinated raids that would dismantle operations Marcus couldn't even comprehend. The sound of car doors slamming outside made everyone freeze. Not the heavy slam of patrol cars, but the precise click of federal vehicles driven by people who carried badges that trumped local authority. Through our front window, I could see Agent Sarah Chen approaching our door with the measured stride of someone whose presence was about to redefine everything these officers thought they understood about domestic disputes and unreliable witnesses. Marcus followed my gaze, his confident expression faltering as he processed what was walking up our driveway at midnight on a Tuesday. "Faith Turner?" Agent Chen's voice carried clearly through the screen door, formal and authoritative in a way that made Officers Rodriguez and Chen stand straighter. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, feeling vindication approaching like dawn after the longest night of my life. "FBI, we received your report about the Romano's warehouse operations. We need to debrief you immediately for tomorrow's coordinated arrests." The silence that followed was absolute. 2 local officers processing the reality that their unstable witness was apparently a federal informant. A husband confronting the possibility that his unemployed drunk wife might be someone he'd never actually known. Agent Chen stepped into our living room, her credentials visible and unquestionable, her presence transforming Marcus's lies into potential obstruction charges faster than he could process what was happening. "Mrs. Turner has been providing intelligence on federal money laundering operations for the past 18 months, Agent Chen announced to the room. "Her reports have been instrumental in building cases that will result in arrests across 3 states tomorrow morning." The truth had finally arrived, wearing a federal badge and carrying the authority to turn lies into evidence, witnesses into heroes, and betrayals into the kind of mistakes that echo through courtrooms and divorce proceedings for years to come. Marcus stood frozen, his confident lies exposed as the delusions of someone who'd never bothered to learn who his wife actually was when she wasn't performing the role of suburban housewife for his benefit. The silence that followed Agent Chen's arrival was so complete I could hear Mrs. Patterson's television through her kitchen window 50 feet away. Officers Rodriguez and Chen stood frozen in our doorway, their notebooks suddenly feeling inadequate for a situation that had just escalated beyond domestic dispute into federal territory. Agent Chen stepped fully into our living room, her credentials catching the overhead light in a way that made everyone understand this was no longer a local police matter. She was maybe 45, compact build, the kind of federal authority that spoke quietly because everyone listened when she did. Officers, she addressed Rodriguez and Chen with professional courtesy that carried an unmistakable edge. I need to speak with Mrs. Turner immediately. This is a matter of national security. National security. The words landed in our suburban living room like a grenade with the pin pulled. Marcus's confident expression began cracking like ice under pressure, while the two patrol officers exchanged glances that said they were suddenly way out of their depth. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez managed, his voice uncertain in a way it hadn't been when he was taking notes about my alleged drinking problem. "We were responding to a domestic disturbance call. The husband here says his wife has been—" "I know exactly what the husband has been saying," Agent Chen interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "And I'm here to tell you that everything he's told you is not only wrong, it's potentially obstruction of a federal investigation." Obstruction. The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. I watched his face drain of color while he processed the reality that his lies weren't just cruel, they were potentially criminal when they interfered with federal operations. "Mrs. Turner," Agent Chen continued, turning toward me with a respect I hadn't felt in months, "I need to thank you for your report this afternoon. The intelligence you provided about the Romano's warehouse operations has allowed us to prevent what would have been the largest money laundering transfer in Newark's history." Intelligence. While Marcus had been explaining to police officers why they shouldn't believe his unstable wife, I'd been providing information that federal agents considered essential to preventing crimes that would have funded everything from drug trafficking to domestic terrorism. "I'm sorry," Marcus's voice cracked on the words, his confident performance crumbling as he struggled to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd married. "What exactly are you saying about my wife?" Agent Chen looked at him with the particular expression reserved for people who'd just revealed how little they understood about situations they'd been confidently explaining to others. "Your wife, Mr. Turner, has been working as a federal consultant for the past 18 months, she said, her words landing like precision strikes against every assumption he'd shared with officers Rodriguez and Chen. "She's provided intelligence that has resulted in arrests across 3 states, prevented financial crimes totaling over $40 million, and helped us identify organized crime networks that have been operating in this area for years." Federal consultant. The truth hit that living room like daylight after the longest night, illuminating exactly how wrong everyone had been about the unemployed drunk who'd been sitting quietly while her own husband destroyed her credibility. "The calls she's been making to various agencies," Agent Chen continued, addressing the patrol officers who were beginning to understand they'd walked into something far bigger than domestic drama. "Those weren't paranoid delusions. Those were intelligence reports that are currently being used in federal courtrooms to prosecute cases that will make headlines tomorrow morning." Officer Chen, the local officer, not the federal agent, lowered her notebook with the slow realization of someone who'd been completely wrong about everything she'd assumed. Beside her, Rodriguez was staring at me like he was seeing a completely different person than the one Marcus had described. "Mrs. Turner's work," Agent Chen announced with finality that brooked no argument, "has been instrumental in preventing crimes that would have affected thousands of American families. She's not mentally unstable. She's not an alcoholic. She's someone who risked her personal safety to provide information that has saved lives." The transformation in that room was immediate and devastating. Marcus stood frozen, his confident lies exposed as the delusions of someone who'd never bothered to learn who his wife actually was, when she wasn't performing the role of suburban housewife for his benefit. "Faith," he whispered, my name sounding foreign in his mouth, like he was addressing a stranger who'd been living in his house. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you?" "Because federal consultants don't announce their work to people who haven't been security cleared," Agent Chen interrupted before I could respond. "Mrs. Turner has been maintaining operational security that protected not only ongoing investigations, but her own safety and the safety of her family." "My safety?" While Marcus had been building his narrative about my failures and mental health problems, I'd been living with the knowledge that the criminals I was helping investigate had killed people for far less than what I'd been documenting. Tears built behind my eyes, not from shame or humiliation, but from something I hadn't felt in months: vindication. The truth was finally standing in my living room, wearing a federal badge and speaking with authority that made Marcus's lies sound like the amateur character assassination they'd always been. The operations Mrs. Turner helped us map will result in coordinated arrests tomorrow morning, Agent Chen continued, her voice filling our modest split level with the weight of federal authority. Arrests that will dismantle organized crime networks that have been operating with impunity for years. Her intelligence work has been exemplary. Exemplary. While my husband had been explaining to police why they couldn't trust anything I said, federal agents had been building cases around information I'd provided, trusting my reports enough to risk their own careers on the accuracy of my observations. Officers Rodriguez and Chen looked like they wanted to disappear through our hardwood floors. Two local cops who'd walked into what they thought was a domestic dispute, only to discover they'd been taking notes on a federal informant while her husband committed what might qualify as witness intimidation. Mr. Turner, Agent Chen addressed my husband with the tone reserved for people who'd made serious errors in judgment. Interfering with federal investigations is a felony. Providing false information about federal witnesses can result in charges that carry significant prison time. Prison time. The words hung in our living room air like smoke from an explosion, carrying implications that would echo through divorce proceedings and criminal courts for years to come. Marcus sank onto our couch like someone whose legs could no longer support the weight of understanding how catastrophically wrong he'd been about everything that mattered. The confident husband who'd been managing his problematic wife now faced the reality that he'd been married to someone the federal government considered essential to national security. "I need to debrief Mrs. Turner immediately," Agent Chen announced, transforming our living room from crime scene back into the safe space it should always have been. "Officers, thank you for your service tonight. Your report will reflect that this was a federal matter requiring no local intervention." No local intervention. The domestic dispute that had started with flashing lights and neighborhood gossip was ending with federal recognition and the kind of vindication that rewrites every assumption people make about suburban housewives and the secrets they carry. As Officers Rodriguez and Chen packed up their notebooks and prepared to leave, I caught them both looking at me with something approaching, the recognition that they'd misjudged not just a situation, but a person whose quiet strength had been protecting their community while they'd been trained to see her as a problem requiring management. Agent Chen waited until the patrol cars pulled away before turning back to me with the professional respect I'd earned through 18 months of risking everything to provide intelligence that kept strangers safe. "Faith," she said, using my first name with the familiarity reserved for valued colleagues, "tomorrow morning, the work you've done will prevent crimes that would have affected thousands of families. You should be proud." Proud. Standing in my living room wearing pajamas and a terry cloth robe, I finally understood what it felt like when truth spoke louder than lies, when recognition came from people who understood what service actually cost. The woman my husband had tried to destroy was about to be revealed as someone the federal government couldn't do without. Marcus tried one last desperate gambit, his voice cracking as he watched his carefully constructed narrative collapse in real time. "She's lying to you," he stammered, pointing at me like I was evidence in a trial he was losing by the second. "Agent or no agent, she's been drinking all day. She's not stable. She's—" "Stop." Agent Chen's voice cut through his protests like a blade through paper. "Just stop." The authority in her tone made everyone freeze. Marcus, mid-gesture. The patrol officers, mid-breath. Even Mrs. Patterson's television seemed to quiet through the kitchen window. "Mr. Turner," Agent Chen continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd had enough of watching good people get destroyed by small minds. "Your wife has provided intelligence that prevented a $40 million money laundering operation scheduled for tomorrow morning. While you were at your office reconciling spreadsheets, she was documenting crimes that fund everything from human trafficking to domestic terrorism." The silence that followed was devastating. Marcus stood frozen in our living room, his confident lies exposed as the delusions of someone who'd never bothered to learn who he'd married. "We know exactly who Faith Turner is," Agent Chen declared with finality that made our modest, split level feel like a courtroom where verdicts were being delivered. The question is, do you? Marcus collapsed into our armchair like someone whose skeleton had just dissolved. The man who'd been managing his problematic wife 20 minutes earlier now looked like he was seeing a stranger, which, in many ways, he was. Officer Rodriguez approached me with the careful respect reserved for people he'd misjudged catastrophically. "Ma'am," his voice carried genuine shame, "we apologize. We had no idea about your work, your service. We should have—" "You couldn't have known," I said quietly, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. The recognition that came from people who finally understood what they were looking at. Officer Chen, the local officer, was shaking her head with the slow realization of someone who'd been completely wrong about everything she'd assumed. 18 months of federal consulting, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. And we treated you like. She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. We all knew how they'd treated me, how Marcus had coached them to see me, how close they'd come to dismissing intelligence that would prevent crimes affecting thousands of families. Agent Chen moved toward our front door, her federal business taking precedence over domestic drama that had already consumed too much of everyone's night. "Mrs. Turner, I need you at Federal Plaza tomorrow morning at 0800, she said with professional efficiency. "The Romano arrests are coordinated for 0900, and we need final debriefing on the warehouse layout you observed this afternoon. Tomorrow morning, while Marcus was drinking his coffee and wondering how his life had imploded in a single evening, I'd be in a federal building watching news coverage of arrests that resulted from intelligence I'd provided while he thought I was day drinking on our couch." As the patrol cars pulled away and Agent Chen's sedan disappeared into the night, our living room felt larger somehow. The lies that had filled it with toxic certainty were gone, replaced by truth that made everything else seem impossibly small. Marcus sat in his chair, head in his hands, processing the magnitude of his miscalculation. The woman he'd tried to destroy in front of law enforcement was someone law enforcement considered essential to justice. I stood by our front window, watching the last of the red and blue lights disappear around the corner, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. The profound peace that comes when people finally see you for who you've always been. "Faith." Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you—" "Because you never asked," I said, turning from the window to look at the man I'd married 3 years ago, the man who'd just tried to convince police officers that I was too unstable to believe. The truth was simple and devastating. He'd never asked what I did during the days he was at work, never asked about the phone calls I made, the reports I filed, the photographs I took. He'd constructed his narrative about my failures without ever bothering to learn what I was actually accomplishing. "I thought I knew you," he whispered, his voice breaking on words that carried the weight of a marriage crumbling in real time. "You knew who you needed me to be," I replied, feeling clarity settle over me like dawn after the longest night. "You never wanted to know who I actually was." The woman he'd married had been someone capable of achievements he couldn't comprehend, willing to risk her safety to protect strangers, strong enough to carry federal secrets while he measured her worth in household chores and social appearances. Standing in our living room at 1:17 a.m., surrounded by the wreckage of assumptions and the birth of truth, I understood something I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Some people will never see you clearly, no matter how much evidence contradicts their preferred narrative. But that night, Agent Chen had seen me. Officers Rodriguez and Chen had finally seen me. The federal government had always seen me. And sometimes, being seen by the right people matters more than being understood by people who've already decided what they want you to be. I looked at Marcus, this man who'd tried to destroy me with lies, now confronting the reality that his unemployed drunk wife was someone whose work would make headlines and prevent tragedies. "The truth has a louder voice than lies," I said, feeling the weight of 18 months of Secret Service finally lifting from my shoulders. "It just takes the right moment to speak." In the reflection of our darkened window, I could see both versions of myself. The woman Marcus had tried to make me broken, unreliable, dismissed, and the woman I'd always been strong, essential, worthy of respect that didn't require his approval. Tomorrow, the whole world would know which version was real. Tonight, that was enough. The lies had been silenced, the truth remained, and I was finally free to be exactly who I'd always been, Someone whose quiet strength had protected thousands of people who would never know my name, but whose safety had depended on my willingness to risk everything for the truth. Marcus could spend the rest of his life trying to understand how he'd been married to a hero without ever bothering to ask what she did when he wasn't watching. But I was done explaining myself to people who preferred comfortable lies to inconvenient truths. The FBI badge was gone. The patrol cars had disappeared. But the woman they'd recognized was still standing in our living room, finally visible to herself in ways that mattered more than any marriage certificate or family approval. Truth doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs the right moment to speak. And tonight, it had spoken clearly enough to echo through federal buildings and family relationships for years to come. Faith's story reminds us that worth isn't defined by the people closest to us, that some of the most important work happens in silence, and that truth has a way of speaking at exactly the right moment, even when those who should support us try to silence it with lies. Subscribe for more stories of unrecognized heroes, the people whose real work happens behind the scenes, whose sacrifices go unnoticed by those who benefit from them, whose strength gets mistaken for weakness by people who never ask the right questions. Because the most important question isn't whether the people in your life understand your worth. It's whether you're living a life worthy of recognition, even when that recognition comes from strangers who understand service better than family who should know you best. Share this story with someone who's ever been misjudged by those closest to them, whose real work goes unseen, whose truth deserves to be heard by people capable of recognizing its value. Truth doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs the right moment to speak.